I'd like to start with the first poem in Sylvia Plath's Ariel. It's called Morning Song. Love set you going like a fat gold watch. The midwife slapped your foot soles, and your bald cry took its place among the elements. Our voices echo, magnifying your arrival. New statue. In a drafty museum, your nakedness shadows our safety. We stand round blankly as walls. I'm no more your mother than the cloud that distills a mirror to reflect its own slow effacement at the wind's hand. All night, your moth breath flickers among the flat pink roses. I wake to listen. A far sea moves in my ear. One cry, and I stumble from bed, cow-heavy and floral in my Victorian nightgown. Your mouth opens clean as a cat's. The window square whitens and swallows its dull stars. And now you try your handful of notes. The clear vowels rise like balloons. When you're reading a novel, your attention is on the progression of time, the forward movement of the plot through its complication and its resolution. A lyric poem, such as that, is less about the progression of time than it is about the attempt to stop time. The lyric tries the impossible. It tries to temporarily stop time, to slow us down, in order to allow for a moment of perception. Sometimes a moment of confusion, sometimes of understanding, sometimes emotional, sometimes intellectual, often a bit of both. For me, that is the main virtue of poetry, and in particular of the lyric poem. Its ability to get me to stop and pay attention to life. Do everything that I'm rushing by because of time, because of the inevitable tick of the clock. And that is what a lyric poem excels at capturing the things, the experiences that we don't see because they're there in front of us all the time. Here's another way to think about the relationship of the lyric poem to time. This is something that I learned from a former professor at this university. His name is Northrop Frye. Frye says that the lyric poem gets written because some normal activity has been blocked, the normal progression of time. And the poet has to write about that block before returning to the world of time. So say, for instance, that you are paralyzed by grief to the point where you simply cannot return to the world. You write a poem about loss until you can. One of the oldest causes of poetry in the world, if you're too broke to buy wine, you write a poem about wine, about drinking wine. It worked for the ancient Sumerians, and it worked for Neil Diamond. The biggest one of all, by far, of course, if you are hurt by love to the point where you cannot return to the everyday world, you write a poem about being hurt by love. If there were no frustrated love affairs, the canon of English poetry would be something like half of its present size. I will go out on a limb, and I will suggest to you that no normal person would be writing poetry if they could be making love. Poetry is what you write when you can't do what you want to do. Frye actually says that the lyric poem is what biologists call a displaced activity. Apparently, chimpanzees also get frustrated in love. And when they do, they dig holes in the ground furiously. So the lyric poem is the human equivalent of a chimpanzee digging a hole in the ground. Chimps dig holes, men join the French Foreign Legion, women eat ice cream, poets write poems. In Morning Song, the normal activity that has been blocked is sleep. Just a good night's sleep. This is a mother with a young child. The speaker has been awakened by her child's cries. She can't go back to sleep, so she writes about what has happened. the perception, the understanding that comes as a consequence of trying to stop time for a moment is harder to understand, harder to paraphrase. I think it's something about time itself, about the realization on behalf of this mother, this speaker, that her child occupies time, occupies an elemental time, time that's greater than she can control. The first line, love sets you going like a fat gold watch. It likens the birth of the child to the winding of a watch, right? With the necessary implication that the watch will wind down, that time will run down, that this child is born awaiting their own death. That child is her child, but she is also another human being with her own life ahead of her. The child is beginning to speak, and her words rise up away from the mother, away from the mother's control, like a lost balloon drifting off into the sky. I think that is what those very difficult lines in the third stanza mean. She says, I'm no more your mother than the cloud that distills a mirror to reflect its own slow effacement at the wind's hand. It's her awareness that another life has been set going here, one that is not really hers. It's a new statue awaiting its own stains, its own cracks. For T.S. Eliot, the secret to writing great poetry was to strive for what he called a continual extinction of personality. The idea was that by suppressing his or her own emotions, the poet could tap into collective emotional experiences. This is Eliot's so-called impersonal theory of poetry. Some of Sylvia Plath's early poetry was written under the influence of that way of thinking about poetry, that modernist way of thinking about poetry. But by the time she got to Ariel, the book that you're reading, her poetry was anything but impersonal. This is highly subjective, highly personal poetry, very, very different from T.S. Eliot's. Most of Sylvia Plath's poems provoke two assumptions. First, that the often painful experiences that these poems are documenting come from somebody else's real life, that these are real events, not fictional events. And second, that that somebody is Sylvia Plath, not an alter ego like Prufrock, but the poet herself. Those assumptions are why critics of Sylvia Plath and other poets like her, notably Robert Lowell, one of her teachers, came up with a new word to describe this kind of poetry. They called it confessional poetry. Confessional poetry. In essence, confessional poetry is poetry that uses a relatively conversational style to expose or confess intimate and often painful details from the poet's own personal life. Confessional poetry is often characterized as a radical break with modernism, with poets like Eliot, with its impersonal theory of poetry. It's not really, because for all of his theorizing about impersonal poetry, Eliot's poetry was never really impersonal, and thank God it wasn't, because it would have been horrible if it was. It just looked impersonal, because instead of Eliot saying, I think the city feels like this, he said, the city feels like this. What the confessional poets did was they dragged that pathetic fallacy into the light. They admitted and even flaunted the self that was always confessing through the mask of Prufrock. Sylvia Plath had a great deal to confess. She was born in Boston in 1932 to a high school teacher who had just married her German professor. She grew up in the village of Winthrop, northeast of Boston, at her parents' house, and a little later at her grandparents' house, which was a beach home outside of Boston with the Atlantic on one side of it and Boston Harbor on the other side, very narrow spit of land. Her father died when she was just 8 years old of diabetes, complications from diabetes. Her mother, after the father's death, moved the family inland to Wellesley, just west of Boston. Plath grew up an ordinary, if extraordinarily intelligent, young American woman of her time. Boys, summer camp, reading, a great deal of reading, a great deal of boys. She won a scholarship to Smith College, one of the best women's colleges in America. This is Plath in her dorm room at Smith. At the time that Plath attended Smith College, very good college, but the main goal of Smith was marriage. That's why you went to Smith, to get a good marriage. In fact, when Plath went there, every freshman had to get nude photographs taken of themselves from the front and from the side, profiles taken by the physical education department. It was meant to see if you had the right posture. The photographs were put on file. We no longer do that at this university. In her third year at Smith, when she was 20 years old, Plath was diagnosed with severe depression, mostly caused by overwork, grade stress. She was trying to write a paper on Ulysses, so it's sort of understandable. She was treated with electroshock therapy without anesthesia, which is now illegal. Electroshock therapy is still used, but not without anesthesia. A month after that, she attempted suicide in her family home. She hid underneath a crawl space in the house, swallowed a bottle of sleeping pills. She was missing for 3 days. The story actually made the front pages of the Boston papers. She was ultimately found by her grandmother, who heard moaning sounds coming from the crawl space under the house. Apparently what had happened was that she swallowed so many sleeping pills so quickly that she simply passed out. And she threw up most of them as a consequence. And then when she woke up, she banged her head on the beam in the crawl space and knocked herself back out again and went back to sleep, so hence 3 days in the crawl space. After graduation, Plath went to Cambridge in England to do graduate work on a full scholarship. All along, she had been writing. Her first published poem appeared when she was just 8 years old in the children's section of the Boston Herald. She never stopped. She was writing poems, short stories, the occasional essay for things like the Atlantic Monthly and the New Yorker, most of whom initially rejected her, and successes in women's magazines like Mademoiselle and 17, which at that time published a great deal of good fiction and good poetry. She did very well for her age, many publications and even prizes. But Sylvia Plath was one of those people who was just never satisfied. And at age 23, she decided that since she was never going to be a real writer, she may as well get married. She may as well fulfill the Smith imperative. She met her future husband that year at a literary party outside of Cambridge, a party meant to launch a poetry magazine. The young British poet Ted Hughes, who was then 25. The story, which has by now become something of a legend, has it that on that first night, she walked up to him at the party and she recited one of his poems to him from memory. They'd never met before. They talked, and Hughes leaned down, kissed her, and took one of her earrings. He said, "I shall keep this." He leaned in again to kiss her, and she bit him hard enough in the neck to draw blood. And that was it, love or something like it. They married 4 months later on Bloomsday, the 16th of June, pardon me. And the following spring, they moved to Massachusetts. Plath taught at Smith, and then Ted taught at Boston. In late 1959, they moved back to England, first to London, and later to a country home, a rundown old country home in Devon. Plath published her first book the following year. It's called The Colossus and Other Poems. Very few reviews, and the reviews that do exist are fairly lukewarm. The following year, she published her first novel, or finished, I should say, her first novel, a book called The Bell Jar, which was published under a pseudonym, the pseudonym Victoria Lucas. It's an autobiographical novel about a young woman interning, as Plath had done, at a women's magazine in New York City. Plath wrote about it in her journals that Virginia Woolf's novels made mine possible. The more obvious influence noted by many reviewers of the time was J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye. It's almost a female version of The Catcher in the Rye. She had 2 children. Frida was born the year that Colossus came out, and Nick was born 2 years later. Frida is the baby in the first poem I read you, Morning Song. In the summer of 1962, Plath discovered by answering the phone at the wrong moment that Ted was having an affair, and they separated. Not amicable at all, a very bitter breakup. Over the next few months, in the fall of 1962, she wrote most of the poems in Ariel, writing in the early morning hours while her children slept. It's one of the most remarkable bursts of creative power in literary history. In December, she and the children moved by themselves into a flat in London, actually a flat that was formerly occupied by William Butler Yeats. Very early on a Monday morning, 11th of February 1963, Plath stuffed towels under the doors to her children's bedrooms. Sorry. I've got a cold, so I'm on medication. That's my excuse. She taped the doors shut, and then she went to the kitchen, and she knelt down and she put her head in the oven, and she turned on the gas. The death certificate says that she died of carbon monoxide poisoning while suffering from depression. Because Sylvia Plath died without a will, her poems became the property of Ted Hughes, her husband. Over the next 30 years, Plath, or Hughes, I should say, slowly released Plath's unpublished work, the first of which was the manuscript that was actually found on her desk when she died, the book that you're reading, Ariel, published in 1965. These are the first editions. I will leave it up to you to guess which is the American first edition and which is the British first edition. It's Plath's title. She collected the poems and she ordered them. Hughes rearranged the order, took some poems out, about a dozen, put a dozen more poems in. Quite a controversial decision, though Hughes said himself, and I believe him, that he did it to make a better book, for no other reason than that. On its release in America, the poet Robert Lowell, who had been Sylvia Plath's teacher, called Ariel a controlled hallucination, the autobiography of a fever. It has since become one of the best-selling books of poetry in the 20th century, ever. The sales of this book of poetry are well past the 500,000 mark. A large part of that fame rests on one poem, and that is Sylvia Plath's most famous poem, a poem called Daddy. For some critics, it's not just Plath's most famous poem, it is the poem of the 20th century. You can hear Sylvia Plath reading it herself. It's readily available. She recorded it for BBC Radio in October of 1962. It is a poem that needs to be heard in a woman's voice, needs to be read in a woman's voice. I'm not going to do it. The poem begins, Daddy, from the starting point of the lyric poem, and that is a blocked activity, something the poet cannot do. In this case, what she cannot do is forget her father, bury her father. It begins, you do not do any more black shoe in which I have lived like a foot for 30 years. The second line of the poem announces a change. You do not do any more. That's how it was in the past. This is how it is going to be from now on. She says in the next stanza that, Daddy, I have had to kill you. You died before I had time. Daddy, I've had to kill you. You died before I had time. Grammatically, that makes no sense, because Daddy, I have had to kill you describes an ongoing action, and you can't have an ongoing murder. Murder is for good. But psychologically, it works. I have had to kill you, and I have to keep on killing you every day because you died before I had time to grow up. There's a very easy Freudian explanation here, probably too easy, but I'm no psychiatrist, so it's all I've got. Freud says that children need to become autonomous from their parents, morally autonomous from their parents. They need to develop what he calls their own superego. For a Freudian, Plath's problem was that she was not allowed to separate herself from her father in the way that children normally outgrow their fathers, their parents, and that is by outgrowing them. He died too early. And right or wrong, Sylvia's mother made the decision that the children would not attend the funeral. So Plath didn't attend her father's, never visit her father's grave until 20 years later with Ted. She wrote in her journal on that visit that she felt cheated, that she was tempted to dig her father up to prove he existed and that he was actually dead. So what Plath was denied psychologically, she had to enact metaphorically in her poetry over and over, the killing of the father, not just in this poem. And that is what Daddy attempts as a poem, to lay her father to rest. In fact, the original title of the poem was Daddy, Daddy, Lie Easy Now. Another way to put the problem of the speaker of this poem, a way it's a little different from a Freudian line, is that because of her father's early death, she has lost her connection to the past, and with it, any semblance of her own identity. She doesn't know her father. She doesn't know his past. She says in the poem that his past in Germany has been scraped flat by war, by the tanks. She can't even find the town that he came from. I never could tell where you put your foot, your root. I never could talk to you. The tongue stuck in my jaw. It's stuck in a barbed wire snare. Eek, 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 eek. I could hardly speak. Because she has no past, she has no self, no sense of who she is. She knows she's of German heritage, but she can't say I in German. Ich. It gets stuck in her throat. She's trapped. In various images in the poem, she refers to herself as a rabbit caught in a snare, or most controversially, as a Jew in the trains on the way to the death camps. Plath's association of herself in this poem and other poems with Holocaust survivors has been a big problem for some readers of this poem, including Seamus Haney. But it makes psychological sense, because for Sylvia Plath, Nazis were powerful, authoritative male figures, the replacement fathers. There's something she fears, but also something that she wants. Because we know so very much about the life and death of Sylvia Plath, the temptation is incredibly strong to read her poems autobiographically, a temptation to which I have obviously succumbed. But the poems cannot be just autobiography. I mean, one woman's tragic story is simply not enough to explain the tremendous appeal of these poems to many, many readers. When she recorded Daddy for the BBC in London in October of 1962, the BBC interviewer asked her if she thought that her poems came more from books or more from her own life. And Plath said, no, my poems come mostly from my own experiences, my own emotional experiences, but that she was not interested in writing just cries from the heart, her words. She thought that artists should be able to control any personal experience, even the most terrifying, like madness or torture, to control and shape that experience into something larger than the self. She said this: I think that personal experience is very important, but certainly it shouldn't be a kind of shut box and mirror-looking narcissistic experience. I believe it should be relevant, and relevant to the larger things, the bigger things, such as Hiroshima and Dachau and so on. For Plath, that is why the Holocaust is there in Daddy, why it's there in others of her poems, to make the personal relevant, to show the universal in and through the particular. It is also there, of course, for the same reason that the violence is there in Flannery O'Connor's short stories, to get our attention. And it worked. Sylvia Plath became famous, immensely famous, partly because of the manner of her death, and partly because of the manner of her art. But as is often the case with artistic success, it was also just a case of very good timing. because Plath's story, her life story, the story of her death, and her poems appeared in the years for American feminism. This is the decade that saw Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, Gloria Steinem's Ms. Magazine. What happened was that, right or wrong, Sylvia Plath became a poster girl for American feminism, and Ted Hughes became its villain, its man in black. Here, for instance, is part of a poem from a 1972 book called Monsters by the American poet and feminist activist Robin Morgan. How can I accuse Ted Hughes of what the entire British and American literary and critical establishment has been at great lengths to deny, without ever saying it in so many words, of course? The murder of Sylvia Plath. The poem goes on from there to threaten to dismember Hughes, to sew up his lips. It says, "We women will blow out his brains." In the wake of all this, Hughes had a terribly difficult ride of it. Some women started attacking him verbally at his readings, some by reading this poem out loud at his readings. Over the years, Sylvia's last name, Hughes, her married name, has been chiseled off of her tombstone at least 3 times. Hughes gave fewer public readings, and he ultimately refused to talk about Sylvia Plath in public at all. He finally broke his silence in 1998, the year before he died, just before he died, with his book called The Birthday Letters. The cover design is by Frida. The book is a series of confessional poems, not Ted's normal mode. These are confessional poems. Almost all of them addressed directly to Plath, written over many years. It's been speculated, I think it's probably just more legend, that he wrote one poem each year on her birthday, hence the title, The Birthday Letters. The book was tremendously well received in England, not so well in America. This is a generalization, but in this story, generally what happens is that the English press sides with Ted, and the American press sides with Sylvia. But it was a huge seller in both countries. This was poetry that read like a scandal newspaper, and the gossip, the literary gossip. We had waited 35 years for his side of the story. I thought I'd read you one of his poems. This is his response, I think, to Daddy. It's a poem called The Shot. Your worship needed a god. Where it lacked one, it found one. Ordinary jocks became gods, deified by your infatuation that seemed to have been designed at birth for a god. He was a god seeker, a god finder. Your daddy had been aiming you at God when his death touched the trigger. In that flash, you saw your whole life. You ricocheted the length of your alpha career with the fury of a high-velocity bullet that cannot shed 1 foot-pound of kinetic energy. The elect more or less died on impact. They were too mortal to take it. They were mind stuff, provisional, speculative, mere auras, sound barrier events along your flight path. But inside your sob-sodden Kleenex and your Saturday night panics, under your hair done this way and done that way, behind what looked like rebounds and the cascade of cries diminuendo, you were undeflected. You were gold-jacketed, solid silver, nickel-tipped, trajectory perfect as through ether. Even the cheek scar, where you seemed to have sideswiped concrete, served as a rifling groove to keep you true. Till your real target hid behind me, your daddy, the god with the smoking gun. For a long time, vague as mist, I did not even know I had been hit, or that you had gone clean through me to bury yourself at last in the heart of the god. In my position, the right witch doctor might have caught you in flight with his bare hands, tossed you cooling, one hand to the other, godless, happy, quieted. I managed a wisp of your hair, your ring, your watch, your nightgown. One thing that the birthday letters makes painfully clear is that Ted Hughes has not managed to escape the story of Sylvia Plath's death by living any more than Sylvia Plath did by dying. To me, Sylvia Plath's life simply cannot be ignored. It's a human story, and it is fundamentally human to be attracted to stories like hers. The challenge, though, for the critic, and I think for the reader, is to say something else. That is to get past this tragic story to whatever core of experience or truth might wait on the other side. Sylvia Plath uses a number of metaphors for herself and her art. In Ariel, Lady Lazarus, she's a Holocaust survivor. She's Lilith, the first mythical wife of Adam. She's a daughter with an Electra complex. Most of the metaphors that she uses to represent herself in the book suggest the ideas of resurrection and anger. But the main metaphor for Plath in this book, the book's controlling metaphor, is not about either of those things. It's not about resurrection, it's not about anger, it's about creativity. What I'm referring to is the title of the book itself, Ariel. Ariel is a character in Shakespeare's play The Tempest, a spirit of the air. It's an illustration of Ariel from 1873. Ariel is identified in a stage direction as he, but never directly identified as he or she in the play itself. Ariel is non-gendered. Ariel was cursed by the witch Sycorax and confined in a tree on an enchanted island. Prospero lands shipwrecked on this island and lets Ariel out of the tree and makes Ariel his servant, his aid in magic. Ariel is all light and air. Ariel can fly, can turn invisible at will. And because of that, and because of how Ariel assists Prospero, Ariel has often been understood by readers, by critics, as a symbol of creation, of creativity, as opposed to Caliban, the symbol of the bestial side of us. The Tempest was the first play that Sylvia Plath ever saw. When she was 12 years old, her mother took her and her brother to see a production of it in Boston. And according to Plath's mother, Aurelia, Sylvia was absolutely captivated by the play, and especially by Ariel. Plath considered several titles for the book that became Ariel. She considered calling it Daddy and Other Poems. She considered calling it The Rival. She considered calling it at one point The Birthday Letters. But she ultimately decided to name it after what she thought was its best poem. That's the poem called Ariel. In my edition, at least, it's on page 28, though I imagine all are different. Ariel. Stasis in darkness. Then the substanceless blue pour of Tor and distances. God's lioness, how one we grow, pivot of heels and knees. The furrow splits and passes. Sister to the brown arc of the neck I cannot catch. Nigger eye berries cast dark hooks. Black sweet blood mouthfuls, shadows, something else, hauls me through air. Thighs, hair, flakes from my heels. White Godiva, I unpeel. Dead hands, dead stringencies. And now I foam to wheat, a glitter of seas. The child's cry melts in the wall, and I am the arrow, the dew that flies suicidal, at one with the drive into the red eye, the cauldron of morning. Plath submitted many of the poems in Ariel to literary magazines just before her death. almost all of them were rejected. They were considered too difficult, too extreme. This was a new kind of poetry. Ariel was one of the few that actually got accepted and was published in the London Observer. But the editors of the London Observer decided that readers would have a hard time understanding what the poem was about, so they changed the title of the poem. They called it The Horse, which, when you read it through, you will see that's exactly what it's about. Plath's friends knew what it was about. She took riding lessons after she and Ted moved with the kids to Devon, and the horse that she learned on was completely coincidentally called Ariel. But readers didn't know that. The London Observer was right in one sense to insist on a clearer title for the poem, because most readers simply would not have got it, not without a great deal of close reading. But in another way, the Observer was very wrong to change the title, because the title of this poem, about riding a runaway horse, is absolutely key to this book, and I think to understanding Plath's mind in the last few months of her life. Plath clearly knew who Ariel was. Ariel's a spirit of the air, not a runaway horse. So why do this? The answer, I think, is that for Sylvia Plath, a runaway horse was the perfect metaphor for creativity, for all that Ariel represents. Creativity, but also the danger of the creative. If you look at how the poem moves, follow how the horse runs. It moves through inactivity, stasis in darkness, the blocked situation of the lyric poem, through a Lazarus-like rebirth at dawn, to flight and light, but a flight and light that is associated with death, the morning dew that flies suicidal. Plath wrote Ariel on her birthday, 27th of October, 1962. Her first birthday without Ted since the two had met. The poem has been read as predicting her suicide. That is, she's riding this horse into her own death. Yes, probably. But I don't think that's all it's about. I think that this poem is not just about where her life was taking her. It's also about where her art was taking her, which happened to be the same place. And that is a place outside the everyday world, the place of the lyric poem, a place that she did not survive. This is from an epitaph for Plath by her close friend and editor at the London Observer, a man by the name of Al Alvarez. In those last poems, she was systematically probing that narrow, violent area between the viable and the impossible, between experience which can be transmuted into poetry and that which is overwhelming. See, the lyric poem tries to stop time, but we live in time. Time is utterly inescapable. So if we're not in time, where are we? As poets or as readers of poetry? We're in the place that Alvarez is attempting to describe, the place that Plath and so many others have attempted to recreate, a place that is not quite possible or survivable. The lyric is the entrance to another world. It's a world that we simply cannot inhabit for long if we are going to hang on to our sanity, because it's a world outside of time. And that is the reason why lyric poems tend to be short. Edgar Allan Poe said no more than 100 lines, because you simply cannot stay there for long. You can't concentrate with that kind of intensity for long. And it is perhaps the reason why lyric poets tend themselves to madness. There are so very many of them, not just Sylvia Plath, Paul Verlaine, Hart Crane, Edgar Allan Poe, John Berryman, Robert Lowell, Sylvia Plath. You could compile an equally long list of casualties from the other half of the lyrics tradition, and that is the musical side, the song lyric. Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin, Tim Buckley, Nick Drake, Kurt Cobain, Elliott Smith. See, the thing is that when a rock star dies, we tend to blame the death on the lifestyle of popular music itself. But maybe, just maybe, the form of the lyric, their form as much as Sylvia's, is as much to blame. There is no shortage of hard living among poets, certainly not among the Canadian poets I know. For whatever reason, we want to explore this other world, the world of the lyric. More often, we want to spend other people to explore it for us. We send artists because we simply cannot go there ourselves. It is too scary, and most of us, almost all of us, lack the tools to describe whatever it is we may find there. The irony for me here is not that so many of these artists end up self-destructing. The irony is that they are destroyed by the very thing that we want them to do, by the very performance that they are expected to give. Ted Hughes says of himself in the birthday letter, says of himself and Sylvia, that we did what poetry told us to do. We did what poetry told us to do. That might be another reason that art exists, another reason that it is necessary, because we need artists to sacrifice themselves for us, to go to places that we are simply not prepared or capable to go ourselves. Last September, there was another artistic suicide. The American novelist and essayist David Foster Wallace. Wallace was the best essayist of his generation. He single-handedly made the essay a literary form again after a demise of centuries. He brought it back to life, breathed new life into it. Every young writer in America wanted to be David Foster Wallace. When he died, the blogs and the papers were all talking again about the apparent link between creativity and suicide. One of the commentators on this had a different take than most. In the end, rather than simply proving the madness of poets, it seems to me that the suicide of David Foster Wallace and the association of literary supremacy and mental illness more generally provides an occasion to rethink the meaning of mental illness itself. For the world would not be richer had Hemingway and Woolf and Dickinson been cured of their supposed ailments. If literary genius and mental illness have grown synonymous, perhaps it is our own diagnostic terminology which is in need of a cure. It's by Ira Wells in the National Post. Since the invention of psychiatry, since the birth of our psychiatric age, every major psychoanalytic critic known to me, except one, has said that all artists are sick. Freud started it. For Freud, art is a symptom of its author's mental problems. For Freud, all of Shakespeare is just about Shakespeare's daddy. Jacques Lacan, Freud's successor, thinks that we're all messed up, but artists especially messed up. The one exception is, of course, Carl Jung. Jung said that a work of art is not a disease, which may be why nobody ever reads Carl Jung anymore. What Ira Wells is saying is that if great art really is sick, if this thing that gives so many, so much, is a disease, then maybe what we need to do is to redefine disease, redefine illness itself. Maybe what drives some artists mad to the point of suicide is not the world of art at all. It's the real world, the world that defines their world as sick. I don't want to end there. I want to end by suggesting something a bit more positive, a more positive reason for art than madness and suicide. Sylvia Plath wrote her best poems at the worst moments of her life. And that should tell us something. What that should tell us is that you can do without poetry until you fall to love, until somebody you love dies, until something goes horribly, horribly wrong, or much less often, horribly, horribly right. And then, when that happens, poetry becomes not just important, but absolutely essential. William Carlos Williams wrote that men die every day for what they miss in poetry. The American poet Thomas Lynch puts it this way. Lynch says, people are born, reborn every day who owe their very beings to poems. People are born every day, reborn, who owe their very beings to poems. Those are two kids right there, Frida and Nicholas Plath, who quite literally owe their lives to poetry. They were conceived because Sylvia Plath memorized one of Ted Hughes' poems and quoted it to him at a party. Ask yourself, how many of you would not be sitting here right now without poetry? What poem did your mother write to your father? What poem did your father write to your mother? What songs were playing on the soundtrack to your conception? Thank you.